Hey YouTube, John Stecker here. Today I wanted to talk about some useful hints and tips and tricks that you can use for your time lapses. I've been doing time lapses for a year now. I've discovered a few things that work pretty well and a bunch of stuff that didn't, and I want to relay that over to you so you can avoid my issues. This is not about the basics of time lapse photography. If you want to learn how to do intervals and all that stuff, plenty of videos out here. This is just some stuff that will help you once you understand the basics of time lapses to do better time lapses, to understand better what's going to work and what's not going to work. So let's first talk about when not to do a time lapse. Time lapses obviously show motion over long periods of time. So if there's not a lot of motion to show, not a lot of activity, not worth a time lapse. It gets pretty boring. But on the other side, if there's too much of a distracting kind of motion, then that's also pretty bad. I did one time lapse I did a planter in the foreground and trees in the background, trees and clouds in the background. And it looked like it was going to be pretty good, but it was a windy day. So the leaves in the planter in the foreground were moving so much that it completely distracted from the rest of the field of view, and it didn't look that good at all. Clouds are a wonderful thing to do for time lapses, but not if it's an overcast, boring kind of day. The clouds are just flat and overcast. No movement's really going to come through. You're just not going to see anything. If it's variable, if just you're getting some overcast, but you're also getting breaks and big fluffy clouds and occasional rain, that can be an interesting time lapse. But if it's just complete overcast, don't bother. If you're doing stars, watch out for light pollution. If you've got a lot of light pollution, it's very difficult to get a good time lapse. You just spend a lot of time processing. It gets very frustrating. So unless you're in a dark area, don't do a star. Do a nighttime time lapse. Also, if you're too near an airport, the air traffic can ruin it too. I'm not far from Dulles Airport in Northern Virginia, and so depending on where I'm focusing it, I can get beautiful stars moving across the sky, but hundreds of light trails going through it. It's all the airplanes in the area. Sliders. I love doing tracking time lapses using a slider, but there are times you don't want to use a slider. To use a slider, you must have something in the foreground. If there's nothing in the foreground or even in the midground, if you're just shooting way off in the distance and you've got a slider, you're not going to notice any sliding movement. I did when I first got a slider for my time lapse. I set it up and I was focusing on the trees and the clouds in the background or on foreground, and it moved 3 foot, but you couldn't tell when I was done. I was like, that was a waste of using a slider. Also, sliders don't have to be level. They can be ascending or descending or vertical. I did a great time lapse where I did a vertical drop of 3 feet over 3 hours in front of a tree, and it worked wonderfully. So if you're going to use a slider, and I love using the slider for my time lapses, don't necessarily do perfectly horizontal. Go down, go up, go straight down, straight up, try something at a different angle. Okay, planning the shot gear. So create your setup ahead of time. So set up your tripods, whatever gear you're going to use. I use the Syrup Genies. I set all the stuff up before I go out, and I make sure that what I've got in mind, just a simple pan, tracking pan, pan tilt, tracking pan tilt. I set that gear up at home first. Make sure it works, make sure that I've got everything worked out before I take it out into the field. That includes all cables, all lenses, battery packs, tripods, etc. I set up everything at home before I go. And when I did that recent time lapse where I did a vertical drop of 3 feet, and I also did a pan at 45 degrees, when I first set it up in my house, the obvious weight didn't work well. I had to make a number of changes to get it to work correctly. So I'd rather do that at home where I've got all my stuff here laid out and I can grab what I need and get it all set up, rather than going in and out and in and out of the house, or God forbid if I'm out in the field and oops, I forgot something. So make sure you set it up ahead of time at home and do a full test. Make sure that it pans, tilts, and tracks, if that's what you've got set up, all correctly at home. Excuse me. That same setup, I had to eventually use a counterweight bag, and I had to come up with a way that the counterweight bag wouldn't get caught on the tripod. I originally had the tripod set up at the top of the magic carpet, and eventually I had to change that to the middle because the counterweight bag was getting in the way. Also consider the weight of your rig. When I set this up, I just had the genies set up on my magic carpet, and it worked the way I set it up had worked. But then when I threw my camera on top and I got a lot more weight, I realized, okay, now I needed to use a counterweight. So make sure that you've got all your cameras, lenses, and battery packs all set up when you test it. And of course, bring extra cables, ropes, tripods, connections, carabiners, whatever you need to make sure that you can make any adjustments you need to out in the field. If you're going to shoot over several hours, there's some other things to consider. Use an external battery, or excuse me, an external power whenever possible. When I can, I use one of these power sources. This just slides into my camera where the battery goes, and I plug it in to an AC outlet, so I never have to worry about my battery dying while I'm doing it. And if I'm nowhere near an outlet to do it, I've got a Duracell battery pack. These are great to jumpstart your car, but I've also got a couple of AC outlets and some USB outlets. So if it's going to be several hours, I'm going to be out in the field, I'm going to grab this, plug this into it, and I don't have to worry about running out of power. When it's something you can use, it's a big heavy thing to schlep around. If you're going to go on a hike for a couple hours, you don't want to carry that. So just be aware of that. Use it when you can. Use AC power when you can. But if you can't, add a battery pack. If you've got the ability to add a battery pack to the bottom of your camera to have extra batteries in it, wonderful. But remember, that's going to be extra weight onto your rig. Okay, plan for the weather. And I don't just mean bring a raincoat. You need to protect your gear. Your camera may be weatherproof, but that doesn't mean all your gear, all your electronic gear is. The Syrup Genies aren't weatherproof. So if I'm going to be shooting out in what could be rain, I make sure I've got the whole thing wrapped up in some sort of protective case, so that I'm not worried. Yeah, the camera's going to be fine out in the rain, but not my Syrup Genie stuff. To protect the batteries if it's cold. So keep the batteries warm until you're ready to shoot, and then put them in the camera. If it continues to be cold, make sure you've got extra batteries that you're keeping warm, and plan to swap them out sometime during your shoot. I've had to do it a couple times, or I just pause the time lapse, swap the batteries real quick, and start up the time lapse again. But be very careful. Try to bump your gear as little as possible. And of course, protect yourself. Bring rain gear, an umbrella, a tent, something to cover yourself. If it's sunny, bring a big floppy hat or something. I got the bald spot, so I need to make sure I'm covering that and not getting sunburn on the, nothing worse than getting sunburn on your bald spot. Once you're at the location, set everything up and run through the movement a couple of times. Make sure there's no obstructions as you're moving. Make sure you're not getting caught on anything that's specific to the environment. You've already tested your gear at home, but now you want to test it out in at location to make sure that you're not pushing it into anything that's at the location. Run through the movement to check framing, where it's going to start, how it's going to move, where it's going to end. Make sure you framed your shots right. Remove neck straps or anything else that's hanging down from your gear or your rig. If there's anything you can't remove, like when I'm using this, it's sticking up in the camera and then hanging down, but I've got plenty of Velcro straps that I will wrap around the tripod to tighten the wires against the tripod so that they're not blowing around, because anything that's hanging down, if there's any kind of wind, it's going to shift your gear. So if there's anything that you can't remove, try to Velcro it down. And sandbag everything that you can. All your, sandbag your tripods. Bring those hooks so you can hook them onto the tripod and then hook it onto the sandbag. Because the wind will move your tripod, especially if it's a little precarious from holding all of this weight. So sandbag. Okay, just before you start shooting, a couple things to do. Turn image review off. Wastes battery. If you're taking a shot every 5 seconds, you don't need to see the image every 5 seconds, so turn image review off. Fix your focus and turn off autofocus. Turn it to manual focus, so it's not trying to autofocus every time. Fix your zoom and even gaffer tape it if you have to make sure that the zoom control doesn't move. And clear your memory card. Depending on how long you're shooting and how often or how short your interval is, you can take a couple thousand photographs. You don't want to run out of memory. While you're shooting, while you're actually doing the shooting, it's kind of boring. So watch your battery. Watch your battery indicator on the camera. If it's going down and you're worried about it, you've got to swap the batteries out. Like I said before, you pause the time lapse, swap it out as fast as you can, start it up again, and try not to touch the gear too much. Try not to move it. And then watch the rig itself, your whole setup. Is the wind pushing it around? Does it look like it might fall over? If the wind's pushing it around and it's jiggling a lot, your time lapse is going to jiggle once you're done. And speaking of once you're done, pack up all your gear, take it home, and plan for a long processing time. Not because it's going to take you a lot of time, but it's just going to take your computer a lot of time to process the images, especially if you want high def or ultra high def or 4K. It just takes time for the computer to process it. So don't think if you're done at 8 p.m. you'll have your time lapse up by 9 p.m. Your ultra high def time lapse up, of 1,400 photographs. It's not going to be up in an hour. It's going to take a couple of hours. I use LR Time Lapse, and the workflow I use doesn't take that long because it's a great program, and it helps me do all the stuff I need to do quickly. But then it takes a long time to do its processing, and then going back to Lightroom, doing the export, and then going back to render the video. And if you want to add music or any sound files to it, you've got to do that someplace else, and then that's going to re-render your video. So it's going to take some time. So plan on it taking some time just for the processing. So that's about it. Those are some, a lot of the stuff that I've learned that I didn't see in the videos when I first learned how to use time lapse. Things that nobody told me and I figured out over time. So I hope that helps you do better time lapses in the future. And as always, thanks for watching.